Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into a topic that I see brought up quite a lot, especially over the last few years, which is the idea that big name authors, and then specifically books from genres that are very trendy, aren't getting the same level of editing as books in the past did. You've probably seen this launched at authors that are really recognizable names. For example, in fantasy you have Sarah J. Maas or Brandon Sanderson, and then also you see this launched just at the entirety of fantasy romance and romantasy books. And I wanted to take an opportunity to go through a book that I picked up recently. It is a newer book. I am not going to say what the book is. I'm just going to go through passages throughout the book that I found to fit within one of four main categories, which would be I felt like there were aspects to it that were very repetitive and not necessarily in a way that felt intentional. I also thought there was perhaps too frequently the use of incomplete sentences or short sentences, so that goes hand in hand somewhat with style because it is very repetitive, but then also sometimes it bordered on feeling grammatically incorrect, and once again without intention, and we'll get into what I mean by with intention and the differences. I also wanted to go through times where dialogue tags were used in ways that were completely unnecessary, and then I wanted to get into some other areas where I felt like, okay, maybe these aren't necessarily technically wrong, but I would reword this a little bit. I would have hoped maybe the editor would have reworded this a little bit or advised, hey, this sentence reads kind of strange. Maybe let's try this instead. And then there is just one typo completely. And I actually usually don't highlight typos because they're usually so infrequent, and I can be very, very forgiving of them because it's such a feat to write a novel. And also the level of detail that editors have to pay attention to is astronomical. I mean, I don't think very many of us realize just how much editors have to do. And so if one typo or a couple typos slip through in a book and they don't have all the other things I was talking about, I'm like, it's human nature, you know? Even professional singers sometimes can be a tiny bit off pitch. And in the case of words, I feel like sometimes you just blink and you happen to miss that it was the wrong there or something like that. And I don't want to be on my high horse being like, oh, hey, like that's the wrong version of there, because that's not helpful. And I'm sure the author and the editor know that and they just missed it. So even though I don't typically highlight typos, it does fit in with this conversation. I am not going to say what the book is because I actually feel like this would be a good opportunity by not revealing the book to be able to just focus on this topic, remove any other outside factors like what subgenre is it, who's the author. Rather than having those things play into our thoughts about this, we can just look at what is shown and then we can kind of discuss from there. As is often the case, Luna Bear is spinning around in circles right in front of me, and she has landed on a spot. She'll probably get up in a minute anyway, but if you heard the little pawing, that's what that was. Now she's just staring at me, as she's wont to do. Anyway, I color coordinated all of the different things, and I'm going to go in order of those things, so I'm going to be bouncing around page count-wise, but I am going to group these all together by category because I just think that makes it easier to see how frequently these things occurred. Also, I am going to have, at the same time this video goes up, a poll over on my community tab that I'd actually really, really appreciate everybody giving their input through, because the idea is going to be how much do the things that we're going to be discussing, how much do those things impact you? And do you think that it negatively impacts your reading experience? Anyway, let's finally jump into it. As noted, I wanted to get further into what I mean by the idea of with intention. So in the case of repetition, sometimes authors purposefully reuse the same word over and over and over again because it's a thematic thing where they want to keep drawing your attention to this word. Or maybe in dialogue, there's a character who's known to use a certain word all the time, and you can dislike the use of the repetition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was wrong to put it in there. Also, sometimes repetition can be used for rhythmic purposes as well. So there's a lot of reasons why repetition could be used, many that I'm not even getting into. But I just wanted to make that clear because I don't necessarily think that's what was happening in these particular instances. I think these were a little bit different than that. And to make it clear, in the effort to not reveal this book, the author, or the subgenre, I have blacked out all of the rest of the text except for what we're going to be focusing on. And if they ever use somebody's name, I have either replaced that name with a fake name, or I'll replace a name with she or he or something like that. So I just wanted to give that heads up. That's why everything's going to be blacked out for the most part. So for this one, it says, his gaze is a silent interrogation. And then right below that, his gaze flicks to my bloodied left arm. Once again, I know I'm going to be on repeat saying this, which is ironic given that this first point is about repetition, but I wouldn't hyper-focus on any of these one issues if they were sparse, few and far between. You know, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. I would just be like, I mean, they use the same word a couple times. I think an editor probably should have been like, maybe don't say his gaze again, right, pretty much back to back. But there's just so many things that were piling up that it was getting harder and harder to focus on the story, and it was very difficult to not notice all of this. So his gaze, pretty much back to back. This next one occurred 4 pages apart. One of them was on page 7, and the other was on page 11. So the sentence itself is fine. It's that it's worded identically across these couple of pages. So a character is looking out, and they're taking note of the size of something. And the first time this happens, it says, for those waves to be visible at this distance, ... I can barely guess at their height. 100 feet? More? That's fine. I don't have an issue with that sentence. But again, 4 pages later, I take a half step back. It's at least ... 3,000 feet in diameter? More? That was very odd because I don't know how, and I've worked with an editor. If you've ever worked with a professional editor, they really, truly will point out so many things. And I think something that comes up a lot is so many of us have written papers, and so many of us are huge readers. And we have edited our own stuff before. Maybe you had, when you were in school, a friend that the two of you would edit each other's papers before you turned them in. And so we have some grasp on the concept of editing, but that's so different from the level of detail that professional editors pay attention to, because if you've worked with them, you don't even know what you don't know, basically, until you start working with an editor. For example, the word leapt versus leaped, they will point out there's oftentimes some kind of certain, I'm going to call it a rubric, we'll say, that they base certain things off of. Like, oh, currently, this year, these sorts of words are advised to be used instead of this version of that word. And they'll have that knowledge of what is the current standard for this use of words. So leapt versus leaped, it will be leaped instead of leapt. Stuff like that. And they will not only ensure that you're using the version that is generally accepted to be the better version, but they will also point out if you switched between them. So a lot of us won't even notice if we used leapt instead of leaped 100 pages later, but they'll say, oh, for consistency's sake, make sure you keep using leaped. Stuff like that. So for these to be 4 pages apart, they're exactly the same. And they weren't back to back 3 times in a row where it feels like it's on purpose for humor or something like that. I think they just missed this. This next example is a character talking. Similar to what I was saying about typos, I actually tend to be pretty forgiving about issues within dialogue because I think a lot of times authors intentionally have characters speaking in a way that is different from the narrative because human beings don't speak perfectly, or because maybe the character, especially in fantasy worlds, will be from a certain place where they talk a certain way versus somebody over here that talks a different way. And also, people just don't realize how often they say the same things over and over again. So because of that, this is not something that typically I would take issue with. But this particular instance, I do take issue with. And also, again, because of how much other stuff we're going to get into, it just all starts to add up. So somebody is talking to the character, and they said, you have questions, I have answers. And gods know you're smart enough to know that you need them. And I was like, just say realize. Just say like, that's an easy fix to not have it read kind of goofy. Because this is not a goofy moment. This is a serious moment. They're like, you need to ally with me. So just have it say, you have questions, I have answers, and gods know you're smart enough to realize that you need them. That's an easy fix. On the topic of editors are going to point out things that you wouldn't even notice. Because I really feel that editors typically have so much knowledge, if even we are noticing these sorts of things, I think that's not good. It would be different if somebody who has a lot of experience notices stuff, because you're like, well, that, of course. If I, for example, am watching a movie where somebody is performing and they're playing violin, it's sometimes I have to just sit back and be like, I know it's fake. It's very obvious it's fake, but it's not obvious to everyone else because they don't play the violin. So I'm not going to be like, oh, this whole movie sucks, because I maybe have a little bit more insight. And also because it's not like I actually expect the actors to learn how to play the violin in a few months before they shoot a certain scene or something like that. Do I want them to at least have a decent grasp on the bow and hold it properly? Yeah, which a lot of times they do, and then they'll have some kind of double that will actually be playing. But when you have the shots where their face is in frame, I get it. I get that's not going to be perfect, and I'm not going to hold them to my level of expertise in that area. In the same way, I think it would be kind of mean if an editor was like, this is not absolutely perfect, where maybe it is fine for the rest of readers. I mean, I say that, but also it is professionally edited. This is a professionally edited book. So, like, publish, like, what? How did you not? Anyway, moving on now to something that kind of falls under the umbrella of repetition, but is its own thing, which is the frequent use of incomplete sentences, sometimes in areas where a comma would have worked. And it's astounding that they didn't just have a comma and then it would have been fine, and rather they had a sentence end and then a new sentence, and because they did that, it's not a complete sentence. Rhythmically and lyrically, sometimes you do play around with incomplete sentences. Sometimes you also, if you have a multiple perspective story, you'll have certain perspectives read slightly different to represent the characters better. I think because we mentioned at the beginning of the video, certain authors that get pointed to as, is this being as edited as in the past? Brandon Sanderson, for example, within the Stormlight Archive, when you go to the interlude chapters and you read from Lift's perspective reads different than Kaladin's perspective, for example. And a lot of times this comes down to how do you use the narrative, even if it's in third person, how do you utilize it to try and create distinction? So sometimes you might have certain characters where maybe their perspective is very disorienting. For example, the book Piranesi, I think, is a good example of if there was this kind of writing style that was choppy and vague and weird and strange, it fits the environment or it fits the headspace the character is in. That's not, in my opinion, what's going on here. First example, the silver beneath our feet begins to throb with rhythmic white, period. Getting rapidly brighter. And if you had just put a comma, then it would have been fine. And I think there's something to the fact that so many of us listen to audiobooks these days, because I wouldn't have known that this was written like this if I heard it on audio, because a good narrator is just going to make it flow. They're going to read it as the silver beneath our feet begins to throb with rhythmic white, getting rapidly brighter. They'll read it better than that, of course, but they're going to read it in a way where you don't know that they ended the sentence, because the narrator is going to be like, I mean, I'm not going to put any kind of break there. I'm just going to keep going. But getting rapidly brighter, I cannot for the life of me figure out why. What was the intention behind? Because I can think of so many examples of why you would want to split sentences up, or why you would want to utilize incomplete sentences. And Andrzej Sapkowski is an example of an author who I think really showcases that you can have really long, borderline run-on sentences, but then when you have an action scene and you're trying to create suspense, you suddenly get really, really short, sometimes one word at a time, to emphasize that. Or, I'm not a fan of, many of you know, the writing style in Fourth Wing where they use period, period, period all the time. But it's obvious that there's intention behind, oh my God. They're trying to purposefully capture this very almost overly melodramatic way of the character's feeling in those moments to create that in you. And also it feels more casual and inviting. And I think that's a story where the point is to be much more fast paced and to make you want to flip the page. And also it is more accessible than maybe the very flowy, beautiful writing. I mean, I don't like that particular thing, but there's a difference between liking certain intentional decisions versus these just being written like this. Am I alone? I guess I'll find out when I look at the poll, but getting rapidly brighter, that's not a sentence. It would have read better with a comma. And this idea that because sometimes maybe this would work fine on audio, is it really that big of a deal? Well, first off, not everybody listens to the audiobooks. Second, accessibility for audiobooks isn't even always great for every single person. So if their only option is the physical copy, then this potentially is going to impact their reading. And then third, I think regardless of whether something works on audio, it's a book at the end of the day, so it should work in written form. If I were to watch a movie and I walked away and I could still hear it, and the acting of what they're saying or how they're portraying something, maybe they're very emotional and they're crying, and I hear it and I think, wow, that's really good acting. But then I go look at the screen and they're making these like happy faces or something. I'd be like, what the heck? It would be weird. It'd be jarring because it's the full picture. The particular medium that is being used in this example is visual as well as having an audio component. So you want the voices to be delivering on the acting, and you want what they're doing with their facial expressions to match. So in the case of writing, it's a written form of storytelling. I want the writing to, if anything, all I'm asking is for it to not get in the way of the story. I'm not even asking for it to be beautiful. I just want it to not be kind of clunky. So the next sentence example, I don't think is as bad as that one, but it's similar. It says, he watches it and then, apparently satisfied, gestures accommodatingly toward the floating disc, period, as if politely offering me to precede him through a doorway. Why is that written like that? You could just have a comma. Because commas and periods mean different things. I think that's what's frustrating for me. They signal something different. And rules of writing can be broken, but you have to be doing it in a way where it is clear you understand what the rules are before you can break them. And then if you're breaking them, it serves some kind of style. And I suppose maybe there's an intentionality with the style here. I just don't know what it is. Next example, her father studies me, then nods, period. Understanding in the motion. I don't really think I need to keep elaborating because I think these speak for themselves. This one, gaze comes back. It says, he finally looks across at me, period. Gaze drifting to my left side. His face twists, regretting past decisions. I'm only reading off some. When I tell you that I used so many tabs because this was constant. And the characters kind of talk like this too. It's not as intense, but to my point before about, well, sometimes you utilize this sort of thing to distinguish certain perspectives from one another. When the narrative kind of sounds like this, and then sometimes characters kind of talk like this, and it just seems like it's all over, doesn't really feel like that's the point. The next example of things we're going to be looking at, though, are the use of dialogue tags where they are completely unnecessary. I've pointed this out before with other traditionally published books. This is always a surefire way to irritate me in writing. Even if none of the other things were there, this would still bother me. So what I mean by this, and this one unfortunately is harder to show examples of, so I'm only going to show a couple, but I'm going to let you know how many pages I spotted this on. It's when you have a paragraph, and at some point within the paragraph, it's already established who is talking. Either because the character spoke, and then there was already some form of some kind of dialogue tag, or pointing out some kind of action of theirs, or the earlier point of like their gaze drifted to my arm, that sort of thing, where it's established who is talking. And then they keep talking, and then at the end of the entire paragraph, it'll say, he said, or she said. And you're like, I know that. I know. I just read a whole paragraph of them talking, and you already told me who was talking. And this is irritating to me because if you think I don't know who's currently talking, you should have established it. But then when you've already established it, you don't need to establish it again. So I'm going to tell you how many pages this occurred on, and then I'll read off a few examples so that you can see what I'm talking about. This happened on page 9, 10, 11, 12, 38, 45, 48. All of the examples I'm showing you, by the way, happened within the first 50 pages. It's just so many instances of these sorts of things popping up. So an example of this, it says, I mute a cry as he lets out an agonized groan. The glistening tip of the sword juts from his chest. Briar has one hand on his shoulder and the other firmly on the blade's hilt, holding him in place from behind. Say nothing except to answer my questions. Tell me what happened when you died. Be truthful. Leave nothing out that I would want to know. He says in thick, and then I just put fantasy language because I don't want to reveal the specific language. I know who it is. You already gave me an indication of them. Right before they started talking, you gave me an indication of them. Even if you wanted to put the dialogue tag, you would put it after the first sentence. If you have sentences of dialogue and then a dialogue tag, you should have put that earlier. It's besides the point then, because if I'm unclear who's talking until the very end, you're almost asking readers to have to go back and be like, okay, wait, okay, so that was that person that was talking. Okay, got it. But you want the story to just flow. So if you were going to have it, you could easily say nothing except to answer my questions. Right? That point of dialogue, say nothing except to answer my questions. Briar says in thick whatever language, tell me what happened when you died. Be truthful, leave nothing out that I would want to know. Just put it right there. That's fine. Just do that. And then another time that this happens, the paragraph starts with dialogue. It says, wind's enough that most of our tracks will be gone, and dusk will help. And the narrative, not the most comforting answer. He starts frantically kicking sand over me. It's fine and still hot and trickles everywhere. Dialogue continues. I'll let you know when it's safe. Until then, whatever you do, stay perfectly still. His muffled voice warns me from the dark. I know who's talking. You don't need to do that. And a lot of times, I almost think the reason that they would put it is because in the other examples that I can't show for spoiler reasons, in the other examples of this, they would say he added or she added or they muttered, almost like as a little extra, they were talking and then under their breath they muttered something. And an easy distinction to ensure that this doesn't feel clunky and weird to have it all the way at the end of the paragraph is just start a new paragraph and then be like, they sighed, and then, say something and it says like they said under their breath or they added. Because they added, it doesn't feel like they're adding anything when it's just ongoing. So imagine, because I can't show you, I wish I could, but if they're talking, and it says he added, at the end, you're like, I get that you mean that last little sentence, but when it's just ongoing, it doesn't feel like an addition. It just feels like part of everything else. So that's why the separation within the structure of the paragraphs would establish much more that it's like, oh yeah, and then they added this. Because if you say he added after all of that, it just feels like it's all part of the same thing. Next issue, the one typo. So instead of the sentence saying the door bangs open, it says the door bangs opens. So that one I don't need to elaborate on. Now for some sentences that maybe fit somewhat within the other things or a combination of other things, or just read kind of strange that I think wouldn't have hurt to just say, hey, this reads kind of funny, because that's another thing editors will do. They'll let you know, I get what you're going for, but this is a little convoluted. Here's a suggestion of how you can change it, or, lots of ways that you can maybe try breaking the sentence up or whatever. Editors will tell you this, or they should. So this one says, I nod mutely, scrutiny moving on to our surrounds. Just to be clear, we are usually used to surrounds being used in the way of the enemy surrounds us, that kind of thing. But it can be a noun. So this is not incorrect, just to be clear in case you've never seen it as a noun. But it still reads kind of funny. I nod mutely, scrutiny moving on to our surround. Loose stones crunching underfoot in the vast hush of the crater. The cheerless slope is getting steeper. This one, I forgot to mention at the beginning that this is part of it. There were a couple of times that there were commas used, but not in a way that was necessary at all. You could just take them out, or you could restructure the sentence and it would flow much better. So before, where we had unnecessary splitting of sentences where a comma would have served just fine, here we have the commas being used, but strangely. So this one says, my voice does crack this time. If you wanted, you could put this time, my voice does crack. That flows better. But my voice does crack this time. I don't really think you need that. You don't really need that comma there. The understanding that you rise to face a new and uncertain normal. Today. The understanding that today you rise to face a new and uncertain normal. I mean, I feel a bit like when I was in school and you would be given these sentences. You'd have a worksheet. Do kids still use worksheets these days? I don't know. You'd have a worksheet and it'd have all these examples of sentences that were worded a certain way, and it would be like, revise this sentence. And you were trying to figure out, okay, like a puzzle, how would I switch the clauses around? Do I need this comma? Would it be better to break this up into multiple sentences? You would have that practice within, I remember doing this kind of stuff in middle school, maybe even earlier. And sometimes there was this is the most correct way to word this sentence. Sometimes there was an actual correct answer, but also sometimes there were other ways that you could restructure things where it would flow better than whatever the initial example was. And in this instance, I kind of think that a lot of these sentences they could have just been worded differently. An additional example of this, I don't respond. Don't know what I can say to that. I don't know what I can say to that. Just take the comma out. Why is the comma there? Going back to overall what the 4 main categories were and excluding the 1 typo. But the 4 main categories of repetition of words, the frequent use of incomplete sentences seemingly without any lyrical consideration or style choice or distinction of voice of the character, anything like that. Just incomplete sentences all over the place. The dialogue tags when it's established who is speaking, and they're very unnecessary. And then also the somewhat awkward wording of sentences. Any one of these by themselves, if it was just, oh, sometimes the sentences are kind of awkward, or they kind of go to short sentences a little too frequently for my taste. If it was any of these things in isolation, I don't think it would be as big of a deal. If it was 2 of these 4 things, I'd probably not love it, but I don't know that it would be enough for me to claim, see, there's definitely a problem with editing or something like that. But all of these things in combination, I DNF'd the book. That's how much it was starting to bother me. And I might try the audiobook to see if then I can at least enjoy the story. But I do want to say 2 things about and there's plenty to add to this, so feel free to add your thoughts. I think with these sorts of things, my inclination is to give benefit of the doubt to the author, because in traditional publishing, I have no idea how many rounds of edits they wanted to have. I don't know what they told the author ahead of time, but I do know that sometimes when you are writing, you get a scene in your head and you just have a lot of flow and you've got writing going. You do all of that, and then sometimes you're advised, hey, don't even bother to self-edit, just keep going. So you're going to have so many mistakes. You're going to have so many mistakes that you don't even realize are present. And if there was a chance that the author just got this story out, they had their first draft, and then they were told, oh, send the manuscript over, don't worry, we'll clean it up. We'll clean it up, no problem at all. And then they didn't. That is unfair, I think, to the author, because you're assuring them that their work is going to be, it's going to get polished. I can't imagine, not even from a writing angle, because all of that is very, very imaginable to me. I can imagine how frustrated I would be if that were to occur. But even from just making videos, because of course, sometimes you sneeze, or sometimes you stumble through your words and you have to stop and then restart a sentence or whatever. And if I had a professional editor who edited my videos, which I don't, which is probably pretty obvious, but if I did have a professional editor who's editing my videos, and they told me, don't worry, I'll make your videos perfect, you won't even have to worry about it. And I was like, okay. And I sent it over, and then they hardly did any editing, and then they uploaded it, and I am awkwardly pausing all the time, or I don't know, I had to blow my nose in the middle of filming and they didn't cut that out. I'd be like, hey, what the heck? I would be furious, especially if that's part of the exchange. That's part of the deal when you are giving your manuscript over to a traditional publishing house. There is that understanding, or at least you would hope. Another scenario that could occur is actually that it's not really fair on the editor. Maybe the author is the one getting the favoritism and the editor is trying and they're like, I think this needs another round of edits though. Or maybe the editor did put in a lot of edits and then they sent it back and the author didn't incorporate any of it and the publisher thought, it's fine, people will buy it. I don't know, because I don't want to put all the blame on the editor if they genuinely were like, no, I think this needs more rounds of edits, and they didn't give that to them. I remember in talking once to Rosaria Munda, the author of the Aurelian Cycle, she said, if I'm not mistaken, that the first book went through, I think, 7 rounds of edits, which is pretty intense, and I wouldn't expect a self-pub author to have 7 rounds of edits, because that is unbelievably expensive. 1 round of edits, especially for a longer book, is going to cost you a lot of money. So if it's self-pub, this is why I can be a little more forgiving of self-pub, because as long as it feels as though it was edited at least a little bit, I can push through maybe certain things. I also will say though, a lot of the self-pub books that I talk about on this channel, to me, feel better edited than this book that we're talking about that is traditionally published. So I don't even know that this is as much of a topic of conversation. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't self-pub books out there that are atrocious with their editing that they didn't even try. I mean, there are people that have a lot of recognition and they put their books out there without any professional editing, and sometimes they have all the means in the world to get them professionally edited, and they just don't because they know people will buy it because they're popular, and you're like, okay, that's hurting self-pub. Because a lot of people are putting in the work, but there is a stereotype about self-pub works that they're going to be garbage, basically. And they're going to be messy and under-edited. So I don't like when people take advantage of, I'm popular, people will buy my book anyway, so why bother? But that said, I think most self-pub authors are putting in a lot of work. If they care that much, they're oftentimes having to foot the bill themselves. So they're saving a ton of money with no guarantee that they'll get any compensation for that. However, when you're talking about traditional publishing, I mean, there is an agreement not just between the publisher and the author, or the author and the editor, or the editor and the publisher. Not only are there agreements in those areas, but there should be anyway, almost like an agreement between them and the readers. When we are spending upwards of, $30 or more for a brand new book, we want to feel as though that price is paying for everything that it took to put that book together. So what are we even paying for at that point? I mean, I don't want to pay for an under-edited book because I don't think it's fair to the author to not have the best version of their book out there. I don't think it's fair to just slam the editor and be like, this is all your fault, you're really bad at your job or something, because again, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I know even when I was talking to my husband about this too, he's like, well, I also don't think it's fair to expect editors to basically write the book for the authors. So how much time are they giving? That's another factor too. How much time are they giving their authors and their editors to actually do the work that they need to do to make the books the best versions they can be? Because both writing and editing take a lot of time. And if you really want to revise, you do need sometimes months, if not years, to get everything really polished. And maybe because of this exchange I'm talking about, of this expectation, readers also, I think we probably could be better about being okay, first off, with sequels or new books by authors or anything like that. We could probably be better about waiting a little bit and not having this expectation of, I need it now, I need it now, I need it now. And also, I think as much as I love ARCs and physical copies of books, oftentimes completed copies of books, not even just ARCs, but completed copies, because, side note, I wouldn't point all these things out if we were talking about an ARC, because it's understood that ARCs are going to have some mistakes in them, oftentimes. But anyway, when they clearly have money for marketing, and when it feels imbalanced, like they're putting way too much in the marketing and not as much in the editing, then, I mean, maybe the average consumer doesn't care that much. I don't know. I don't want to say they don't notice, because I think a lot of people notice, but maybe they don't care that much, which is why I was asking about, please let me know your thoughts in the poll. But for me, I do care, and I wonder if, if you're putting all this money into marketing, perhaps, and you're getting all these packages to send out to creators and bookish influencers and things like that. If you're putting all that money in that because you're like, we get more return on our investment when we do this, which, hey, isn't that better for the author anyway? But what is it saying about literature as a whole? And also in the case of fantasy, also, this is going to sound so dramatic if you were like, I didn't think any of these things were that big of a deal. But for fantasy specifically, I feel like for years and years and years, readers were pushing back on the idea that fantasy is less than. And you would have even sometimes fantasy authors feed into the idea that fantasy typically isn't as serious and shouldn't be taken as seriously as books in other genres, literature, lit fiction, for example. And a lot of times it's like, no, you can say so many amazing things. You can tell really, really moving stories within fantasy. It's just, you can do all the same things that literary fiction can do, if you're using that as an example. But then you can have dragons, is the joke usually of how people would capture this idea. But if we continuously keep, I guess, just accepting this level of presentation at the end of the day, I don't know if it's going to change. And I don't know what to do about that, because I don't want their careers to suffer. And again, I don't know the situation. Maybe the author was really wanting to be able to incorporate more edits and have more rounds of edits, and they weren't given that. I don't know. I don't know the situation. And I don't want them to suffer for that. But I wouldn't purchase this book. If I had checked this out from the library and I was reading it, I mean, I already said I DNF'd it. I think I said that. I wouldn't go out and buy a copy. So I hope that at some point a little bit more time is given all around to everybody who needs it. A lot of people within publishing also are not paid enough. So I feel like we need to maybe, like I was saying before, maybe the solution is let's balance out where the money is going and who is making these decisions. Maybe they need to think about them a little bit more. But maybe none of you agree with me. Maybe you thought all of these examples were just fine. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry for being so dramatic. But to me, this, I think, could have been polished a little bit better. And I hope that it doesn't negatively impact too many of you in your reading. But these sorts of things, I think, are irritating enough of us. And as I said, I think it is unfortunately indicative of where we're going with our books. If we're so focused on sprayed edges, we're so focused on not just pretty editions, but every single story is going to have their own exclusive edition, but not any single one story is going to have a well-polished edition. And that's the part I care about.